Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Here I present the Oscar-nominated documentary Shell Shock, addressing what shell shock is, when it developed in World War I, what its symptoms are, and what treatment was like during that century. The documentary also goes in depth about what shell shock had become during the 20th century during the Vietnam War, as well as in present day's recent Afghanistan and Iraqi war. Now, shell shock, also known as soldier's heart, combat fatigue, and war neurosis, is known as psychological disturbance caused by prolonged exposure to active warfare, especially being under bombardment, at least according to Google's definition. The term was created during World War I to describe the unknown and unnormal behavior expressed by the soldiers. At the time, though, PTSD, the term, wasn't created yet. When did shell shock develop? Spartacus Educational stated as early as the first winter of the war, there were indications of a high level of mental breakdown among hospitalized men and officers. The website also informally says, now by 1960, over 40% of the casualties in fighting zones were victims of shell shock. By the end of the war, over 80,000 cases had passed through British Army medical facilities. The term shell shock wasn't well known until Charles Myers released a paper about observing 3 patients suffering from PTSD, according to an article on APA.org. It was originally thought that shell shock was caused by the exposure of exploding shells, hence its given name. However, Myers, a medical officer that also fought during the war, realized it was actually caused by trauma. Furthermore, a BBC article called Shell Shock during World War I addressed the symptoms. These included fatigue, tremors, hearing loss, confusion, and nightmares. Soldiers would also have equal sufferings to their actions and duties that they took part in battle, such as snipers would lose their eyesight. Soldiers would also have stomach cramps if they stabbed their enemies even in their abdomens. Over 20,000 men suffered from shell shock. History.com reported if shell shock lasted over 6 months, it wasn't caused by the war because it was believed to be short-term. Having shell shock was a sign of emotional weakness and cowardliness. Treatment was often very harsh. At most hospitals, it included solitary confinement, disciplinary treatment, electric shock treatment, emotional deprivation, shaming, and physical re-education. The image to the left is of a soldier suffering from shell shock being treated with electric shock therapy by the nurse as she controls it. However, there was one famous hospital that actually did help their veterans. Another article on BBC acknowledged the Newton Abbot Seal Hain, a hospital for people suffering from shell shock. There, a doctor named Arthur Hurst was known as a miracle worker, able to cure 90% of his patients within one session. Shell shock did have an effect on the war. The emotional disorders alone caused 1/3 of all discharges. The Army dealt with over 80,000 cases of trauma. Over 80% of soldiers that went to hospitals were never able to return to the battlefield. Soldiers also had a loss of reputation among their fellow men in society. They were either shamed by commanders, soldiers, family members, or the community itself. Now on to Vietnam. Vietnam also had its fair share of PTSD amongst its soldiers. About 5 years after the war had ended, PTSD was officially recognized as a mental condition. Northwestern, the website, also said that about 31% of the male American veterans suffered from PTSD. 1 in 10 veterans still are impacted from PTSD symptoms even 4 decades after the war. That's about 283,000 people. The MayoClinic.org also states that the following are signs of having post-traumatic stress disorder: insomnia, nightmares, flashbacks and unwanted memories, irritability, mistrust, social isolation, anxiety, loneliness, and guilt. Dr. Weirick, a daughter of a Vietnam veteran and a veteran herself, is a counselor for fellow vets. Her clients felt that they couldn't even speak about their experiences due to people disbelieving and feeling ashamed, being told to man up about their depression and anxiety, forcing them to repress it all down. Very unhealthy. PTSD is seen through jitteriness, flashbacks, and anxiety attacks, according to Dr. Weirick. Usually, veterans turn to drugs and alcohol to numb their trauma and reduce their amount of flashbacks. Vets also suffered extreme outbursts of uncontrollable anger. Although veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq were not drafted, they did usually have 4 to 5 deployments, compared to 1 or 2 on average like those from Vietnam. Lastly, according to Very Well Mind, Afghanistan and Iraq vets have had anger issues caused from PTSD, often having to go to anger management classes. 62% of service 62% of service members reporting having a form of mental health care after returning home, including 11% with medication, 13% with individual therapy, 12% with group therapy, and 10% through marital or family therapy. That was the miraculous documentary Shell Shock, written by Caitlin Younghans, researched by Caitlin Younghans, filmed and recorded by Caitlin Younghans. Thank you to all of the collaborating resources here marked at the end that made this documentary possible.